Well, thanks very much to the Asia Society and to the National Committee on U.S China Relations and to all of the other people who were able to allow me to get out to this fantastic building and venue and to have the chance to talk to you today about a subject that I suspect is not often covered here. So I hope this will be of interest because I think China's relationship with Pakistan has really been the country's most secretive, sensitive, and also closest relationship. A former U.S. ambassador to China described to me how over the years the conversation between the United States and China about almost every other country had opened up. Iran, Sudan, Myanmar, even North Korea, with one exception, and that exception was Pakistan, the single country that the US and China still couldn't talk about openly and freely. There's all sorts of language used to describe the relationship. Very flowery language, higher than the highest mountains, deeper than the deepest oceans, sweeter than honey, iron brothers was the latest innovation in the last couple of years. One of the pithiest descriptions came from the former Chinese head of military intelligence, Xiong Guangkai, who, when he said, Pakistan is China's Israel. It's a very unusual case in Chinese foreign policy. Not just China's closest friend, but arguably its only real friend in international relations. So many of Beijing's other relationships are dependent on some particular government or regime staying in power, not Pakistan, where support for ties with China extends across all the major political parties across the political spectrum, the army and the Pakistani public itself. When you look at opinion surveys on China, relative levels of popularity of China among populations across the world, there's often one country that ranks as this striking outlier, which is Pakistan, where public opinion favorable opinion towards China often pushes 80%, even 90% at times. It's very striking. Yet this is a relationship that outside India hasn't really attracted a huge amount of attention. When I wrote this book, which is a nice picture of it up there behind us, the only extended treatment on the subject of China-Pakistan relations, the last time to have an extended treatment was basically the 1970s. There hadn't been a single author treatment of this relationship since then. And this is partly because of its secretive nature. It's hard for people to figure out what's going on in a relationship that's so dominated by the armies and the intelligence services on both sides. It's probably the only international relationship that China has that's really kind of where the PLA has a lead role on the Chinese side. There's also a sort of question posed about whether perhaps the glory days of this relationship had passed, a relationship that was important in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that perhaps the relationship no longer mattered in quite the same way in an era in which China was an emerging superpower. In fact, if we'd been talking 2 or 3 years back about China, Pakistan, China's role in its western periphery, Afghanistan, or any of these other subjects, we'd have been spending a lot of time talking about Chinese inactivity. Why are there no big investment plans moving forward? What happened to all the ambitious plans for ports and pipelines and things that have been so much written about? Why won't China do anything significant in Afghanistan? Why is China so unwilling to cooperate in trying to stabilize its western periphery? Then this year, as Kelly mentioned earlier, we saw some really quite dramatic developments. First, Xi Jinping went to Pakistan and unveiled, I think, probably the largest single overseas package of investments that China has anywhere in the world, and notably not just an investment package, a sort of development-focused investment package, an ambitious set of plans to transform the infrastructure and energy situation in Pakistan, a really unique case of what China's doing that really has no other obvious comparison yet. Then a little later in the year, only a couple of months later, we saw China and Pakistan putting together the first formal peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government in Murree, just outside Islamabad. Afghanistan has become increasingly one of the closest areas of coordination between China and the United States, one of the only kind of classic foreign policy cases where the two sides really see very much eye to eye. And China's moved from a position on the margins, where it was for some time. In Afghanistan, I have put China as a sort of third or fourth tier actor in terms of its significance, to suddenly being one of the main actors. The Afghan government pushing for talks to be hosted in China. And the last time I was out in Pakistan, I remember being struck by this statement from a Taliban spokesman when he said that China was the country that we trust most. What happened? How did this change take place, and where is all of this headed? First of all, just to give a bit of context about the China-Pakistan relationship itself. China-Pakistan relationship has really always been a security-centric relationship. In the 50s, when Pakistan was essentially a US ally that was joining various treaty organizations, some of which had China essentially as their target, the relationship was relatively distant, even though Pakistan was one of the first countries to recognize China diplomatically and the first Muslim country to recognize China. The relationship really came together as a result of the two sides' shared antipathy for India. 3 wars in particular, and the first two, 1962 and 1965, that really set the parameters of the relationship. The two sides saw the mutual advantage that could be derived if they coordinated more closely in dealing with their shared opponent. And 1965 was the point at which some of this lavish language that I mentioned at the beginning, the talk of the all-weather friendship really started. This was the point where, when the US cut off arms supplies to Pakistan, nominally its ally, China threatened to intervene on Pakistan's behalf, gave ultimatums to India, and although it never did actually intervene, the resonance of the moment was so profound that when the Chinese Prime Minister came to Lahore in 1966, he was carried by cheering crowds through the streets. In 1971, although again you didn't see Chinese intervention, it was a moment where the United States and Pakistan alike sought to have China swing in on Pakistan's behalf in the war, and where India still had to base so many of its calculations in the lead up to thinking about the role of potential Chinese intervention, as it has ever since and still does to this day. The concept of the two-front war that was not there before the China-Pakistan relationship existed in these terms has never really moved out of Indian strategic planning. Pakistan also, for this period of time, provided a series of important roles for China during a period of some isolation. First of all, it provided an air route out for China when it was isolated from international air corridors. It helped, of course, most significantly in the opening of relations with the United States, where it played this vital bridging role, and Pakistan was the country of 2 or 3 that might have helped play this, that China trusted to take on this responsibility. And this role as broker, middleman, and trusted partner in some of these other relationships, Saudi Arabia later, other cases too, has continued for a long time. But despite the shared opponent, the two sides didn't always agree on strategy. They had very different military cultures. Pakistan coming from a tradition of kind of Sandhurst, the British Indian Army, these sorts of things. China coming from a sort of Long March culture, a Long March Leninist tradition, and this often led to some quite significant clashes actually between the two sides in private. In 1965, when when Ayub Khan went to try to secure China's support try to decide what form Chinese intervention might take in the war. He went for this secret meeting with Zhou Enlai and Chen Yi, where he was told by them that that Pakistan would continue to have China's backing, but he should think about mounting guerrilla attacks on India, even if one or two major cities were lost. You must keep fighting, they said, even if you have to withdraw to the hills. Ayub Khan replied, Mr. Prime Minister, I think you're being rash, and went home and found a ceasefire. This was so alien to the tradition of Pakistani war fighting, and you have a number of these sorts of different cases through the years. And in the end, China never did intervene militarily on Pakistan's behalf. What you had after the 1971 war was essentially a giant procurement relationship. Although the two-front war hasn't completely disappeared from the collective imagination, the shift was less about China intervening on Pakistan's behalf or any mutual intervention on each other's behalves, more about how can China help build up Pakistan's military capabilities. China became Pakistan's leading arms supplier, a position that it's only relinquished on a couple of occasions since then. And the most significant act of procurement, because in practice, although Pakistan benefited from a lot of kind of low-level Chinese military kit, quite often the material from the US side at the higher technology level was more appreciated, with one major exception, which was the nuclear program, where China played a vital role in helping to develop Pakistan's nuclear program and missile program, including probably the only example we have of one state transferring highly enriched uranium to another. But China was supposed to benefit from all of this too. It was supposed to be a two-way flow, that China would benefit from Western technology, Western weapons, access to centrifuge technology and these sorts of things. This was the other reason, the other way in which Pakistan acted as a sort of reverse bridge to the West as well for China. And that's one of the reasons that China's always been considered it so important for Pakistan to have good relations with the United States. But this strategic affinity between the two sides and cooperation on an area of such sensitivity really built an unusual level of trust between the two sides that has never really been replicated in any of China's other relationships to that degree. And also a relationship that, even though originally founded on India and that still has India as a sort of glue of sorts between the two sides in terms of their strategic interests, looks well beyond India and is not now as India focused in the way that it was back in the 60s. And I think the 90s were a period where the relationship was really meaningfully tested by shifts in what China was as a power. It should have been a period of some vulnerability for the China-Pakistan relationship, as China rebalanced its strategy more towards economic goals, the normalization of relations with India. But indicative of the stickiness of the relationship was that it didn't take a hit during this period of time. Military cooperation, nuclear cooperation, all the forms of cooperation that were there continued and did so in the teeth of significant opposition during that phase from the United States. In the 1980s, the most important phase of China-Pakistan nuclear cooperation, there was a degree of a blind eye turned. In the 90s, by contrast, when the three sides were not working together against a mutual opponent in the form of the Soviet Union, Chinese transfers of materials had to take place under U.S. sanctions at point. And this was the period where the use of this phrase, Pakistan is China's Israel, first appeared. From Xiong Kai, fed up from having to defend the relationship to his U.S. interlocutors so many times during this kind of pressure over the proliferation issue. But the next phase in the relationship should have been a major takeoff in economic cooperation, a more kind of balanced relationship between the two sides. There were plans drawn up for a transport and energy corridor that would lead from the port at Gwadar to Xinjiang, something that we now have in a revived version today. Tens of billions of dollars were promised before by China to Pakistan. And yet the investment relationship had always been a huge disappointment. Some of the mega projects were completed. Gwadar Port itself in its first phase, some of the nuclear power stations, the Karakoram Highway, of course, the physical manifestation of the idea that the relationship between the two sides is higher than the highest mountains. But these projects always had as much of a strategic rationale as a commercial one. For various reasons, government incapacity, broader problems in the Pakistani economy, and in some cases just lack of clear economic justification, many of these initiatives never took off. Instead, more recently, the relationship and these economic projects ended up being trumped by a lot of the security risks, threats to projects that moved from Baluchi groups initially to the Pakistani Taliban in the later years. Pakistan became pretty much the most dangerous place for a Chinese worker in any location in the world. Kidnappings and killings of Chinese workers took off in a very worrying phase for China, and a lot of these projects went into pretty much complete stasis. And we started to have a phase where China started worrying about the broader situation in Pakistan, rising militancy, threats to the projects, and even concerns about what the long-term future might look like if Islamist sympathies in the population translated ultimately into the Pakistani military. So when she went to Pakistan and announced this huge investment package, there was some surprise from people, and actually I think some skepticism, including in lots of the press coverage. We've seen these promises before and they haven't come through. Why would China put all of these resources into Pakistan? Now there are some contingent factors that have affected it. There's a government in Pakistan at the moment that I think China feels it can work with better than its predecessor, an economy in Pakistan that's starting to improve, levels of violence declining, and military action taken against the Uyghur groups that have been one of China's chief concerns operating out of North Waziristan, a sense that the conditions are more propitious. But really Pakistan is now sitting at the confluence of several broader new factors in Chinese policy that I'll talk through in just the last few minutes of this talk. Many of them combine under the umbrella of One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road Economic Belt and Maritime Silk Road. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the first instance, really, one of the first very serious instances of a much more ambitious set of schemes on China's part, the most advanced part, perhaps, of this scheme, and one of the first places where the plans for it are really ready to roll forward. The economic scale envisaged by some of the researchers on the Chinese side for what the investments between the economic Silk Road and the economic belt and maritime Silk Road might add up to comes at some estimates to several $1 trillion of new outbound investment on China's part. A huge set of infrastructure plans to connect China across Eurasia to its principal markets in Europe and its principal energy suppliers in the Middle East and East Africa, with all the different pieces in between and a substantial network of new infrastructure connections in between that. What the One Belt, One Road plan is about precisely is something that is in some ways slightly elusive. It's almost a sort of amorphous collection of a whole series of different schemes and motivations that sometimes calls to mind the story about the blind men and the elephant. Not everyone would agree on the whole list of factors, but and different emphasis is placed whether you're looking at it economically or strategically. But there's a few strands that that emerge. Partly it's a means to outsource Chinese industrial capacity, partly a means of ensuring that the huge companies that have spent the better part of 3 decades developing China would not be hemorrhaging jobs as fixed investment in China slowed. Partly a way to build new markets for Chinese products, and partly a way to catalyse an economic takeoff in China's western regions, partly a way to ensure better value for China's huge foreign currency reserves than recycling them into US Treasury bills, partly a way to provide alternatives to the maritime transportation routes that left China feeling vulnerable to choke points such as the Malacca Strait, and also a strategy to advance China's presence and influence in parts of the world where it felt, unlike in East Asia, that it would run into less political resistance from the United States. In fact, regions where it saw the US stepping back its role. And finally, that it would help to stabilize an arc of volatile countries spreading out from China's western provinces and feeding into what is a worsening situation in lots of respects in Xinjiang. Whatever the relative balance of these elements, I think it tells us a few bigger things about where Chinese foreign policy and foreign economic strategy is headed that apply partly to Pakistan but also look beyond Pakistan. First of all, China's now being more serious about is taking more seriously its role as a continental power rather than a maritime power. So much of the energy that had gone into maritime strategy in the last period, while China neglected in a certain sense its traditional foreign policy arc looking west through Central Asia, across Eurasia, that's come to an end. The maritime piece has not certainly come to an end, but Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and potentially ultimately the Middle East too, now start to weigh more seriously in foreign policy than they really have over the last couple of decades. Some of that's connected to, of course, the terrorism threat in China also worsening the situation in Xinjiang since 2008 in particular, deteriorating, and terrorist attacks in major Chinese cities. And the ambition on China's part has been how do we stabilize using the means that we have, which are largely economic, the arc of countries looking out to our west. One Chinese expert that I talked to described the intention of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, for instance, its ambition as to transform the social and economic structure of Pakistan. Quite ambitious and not the sort of language that one heard before about non-interference. It's a stabilization plan partly for the Western periphery. And what it means is that China's making some of these investments not just despite some of the security risks that are there, but also because of them. It sees the willingness to pump these sums of money in as perhaps the only way that it can find whether this is a successful theory or not, but the only means that it thinks it has to help bring about stability and change some of the incentives in its Western periphery. Second piece, non-alignment in Chinese foreign policy is softly fading, along with some of the other precepts such as non-interference. China's thinking much more seriously about friends and allies than it used to, and of course, notably, if you look in Chinese foreign policy, there aren't very many friends and allies. It's seen as a significant strategic disadvantage for China vis-a-vis versus the United States, the US alliance system. And some of the countries function more as liabilities than assets. But friends and allies matter more as China becomes a power with more global reach. It wants naval facilities that it can count on, as we saw after the need to evacuate some of its personnel from Libya and from Yemen more recently. It needs countries that it can count on to use their air facilities, naval facilities in times of crisis, including in crises that may involve conflicts with other states. And there aren't very many countries it can count on for that. Pakistan, perhaps preeminently among any. And that means that countries like Pakistan in Chinese foreign policy need protected, stabilized, and even rewarded in ways that were less true before. Lastly, that assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy has some benefits as well. the idea that China's become a more assertive power has almost become a truism in the last few years. But in East Asia, that, of course, has tended to be somewhat problematic in nature. More concern among China's neighbors about the role that it's playing in maritime disputes in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and a general concern, not just in the military realm, that China's been throwing its weight around in ways that various people have found uncomfortable. But the flip side of this is that in many areas, Chinese assertiveness is also what people have been looking for from China for many years. A move from caution, defensiveness, sort of narrow conception of defending interests within a system, free riding, to Beijing taking a more active, risk-taking, trying to shape politics kind of role in the world, particularly through economic means. And I think this has been particularly evident in the case of Afghanistan, to take one of the most interesting recent cases. Afghanistan, where unlike Pakistan, China had a very minimal relationship and only really paid attention when there was a security threat to China. In the 80s, that was the Soviet Union's presence there. In the 90s, the rise of the Taliban hosting various Uyghur militant groups. But it pretty much sat out the last decade in Afghanistan because it didn't really want either side to win. Then, in the last few years, you saw really very substantial growing involvement on China's part. The push for the peace process, sums of money being put in for aid and assistance, concerns about the risks to these Silk Road projects, fear of safe havens developing there. And finally, you have started to see China taking on a role in Afghanistan that, as I mentioned, has really put it among the top tier of actors there, and the country that's being seen as the US draws down as providing some of the greatest hope for the new government in Afghanistan to be able to stabilize the country. Where does this leave us? I think we just saw with Xi Jinping's visit to the US that despite the fact that there are all of these disputes between the two sides on cyber, maritime issues in East Asia, and a number of cross-cutting global issues, that there are cases increasingly where, despite growing competition between the two sides, there are areas where it's actually simultaneously easier to reach agreement than it used to be. There's a richer agenda than there used to be. Climate, development coordination, where you've seen some really quite significant deals reached in the last visit, and Afghanistan, where cooperation is greater than we've seen before. And I think we're now really entering a period where, although I think the intensifying competition with the United States in East Asia is a real and difficult phenomenon, the region to China's west in particular is now an area where I think we need to think more expansively about how a China that's looking to use its economic and political weight to deliver something that starts to look a bit closer to global public goods might change some of the political and security incentives that have been in quite a bad place in some of these countries for some time. And that includes, to come back to Pakistan, that certainly includes Pakistan itself. I'll close with a quote from a book by a Pakistani friend who said, "The Pakistanis love China for what it can do for them, while the Chinese love Pakistanis despite what they do to themselves." Thank you. I think, this is actually where some of these One Belt, One Road plans are particularly interesting. I see the One Belt, One Road plans as partly a means of channeling resources towards Chinese industry in a way that matches what they did after 2008, when there was the kind of enormous internally directed stimulus. In a sense, I think this is, some of these plans are an externally directed stimulus, but using a lot of the same companies that benefited from all of the fixed investment in China before. So clearly there are a number of investments that you would expect would would suffer in sectors that were integrally involved in the last phase of China's growth. But I think some of these investment plans that we're looking at, the infrastructure investment plans in particular, are actually kind of part of the plan on China's part to drive growth. And some of that's about channeling resources to Chinese companies. Some of it is about developing some of these markets. Some of it is trying to tap new growth drivers in China that have not been there before, particularly some of the Western provinces. So I think there's kinds of investment from China that will actually increase massively and that can be sustained, and that unless barring really worst case scenarios for the Chinese economy, that can be sustained given the level of foreign currency reserves that are there, and the other financing means that exist in China, to be able to continue to funnel those resources to some of these new plans.
You talk about how Modi's ascension in India may or may not have changed any of the dynamics. If reforms actually happen, there is some prospect of further high growth rates in India, stronger India going forward. What would the Pakistan-Chinese view of that development be?
I mean, China has always sought to benefit economically from the India relationship and has actually tended to encourage Pakistan to benefit economically from the relationship with India in a way that clearly it doesn't at the moment. China has tended to has encouraged Pakistan to try to treat the India relationship almost as it treats the India relationship, which is sort of strategic competition while yielding as much trade benefit, at least, whether the investments are obviously more restricted as possible. So actually, since Modi came to power, there's been a level of enthusiasm on the economic side on China's part, a sense that he actually might have the capacity to push against some of the inhibitions that there have been on Sino-Indian trade and Sino-Indian investment in particular, that have kind of actually, particularly in the last few years, kind of tapered off the growth and economic benefits that could be achieved between the two sides. But I think the sense is that this should be able to exist simultaneously with what is actually also deepening competition with India in certain ways at the political and strategic level, where Modi's clearly been quite forward-leaning on ties with the United States, and with Abe and others that are clearly seen in quite a problematic light on the Chinese side, and where ties with Pakistan have been in a difficult place, partly because of, as usual, there are different pieces to it, but certainly where Modi's also taken quite a forward-leaning stance on some of those issues as well, and that's created for a more difficult environment.
President Xi Jinping has inspired the world with his commitment towards the win-win strategy of cooperation, which he has called for with the process of development with nations of the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and over 50-something nations have joined with China with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has had a strong impact on Pakistan as well, especially in relation to scientific projects, building of rail systems, building of corridors of development. How do you see the role of the United States in understanding our commitment to join with this new direction that's being set forth by China in terms of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the win-win cooperation that President Xi Jinping has put forward?
Interesting. I think it has been understood by most of the people who were formulating the initial phase of the response to China on the AIIB that response was a screw-up, to put it less colourfully than words that I have heard from various people in the National Security Council. I think it's reflective of the fact that this phase of what China is doing is actually in one way, a more difficult and complex thing to figure out a response to, because what you have with you had a period of time in which there were certain actions that China was taking that were sort of self-evidently problematic, and the question was, how do you navigate the response to some of these things in US policy? There's now with a number of these strategic economic initiatives something more of a mixed picture, and the relative balance of these things sort of exists in the same a group of people who have the same shared objectives, say in seeing certain standards for governance and environmental rights and labor rights and things in the way that some of these financing mechanisms work, kind of very different views about how to respond to some of these Chinese initiatives. So, of course, a number of countries believed that the appropriate thing was to join the bank, influence it from the inside, and welcome what does actually look like an effort on China's part to do something multilaterally that does put its projects under a lot more scrutiny and does put a number of new standards and on projects that, if it wanted to, it could finance bilaterally. It could use the same money, do the thing bilaterally. And I mean, when I saw Jin Li-chun, the head of the AIIB, when he came through Washington, the emphasis was really, I mean, we can do our corrupt deals bilaterally if we want to do this. This is about higher standards that we want for the projects and the money that we will be channeling out. But of course, when you're looking out at it from Japan and the ADB, which in particular it seems like a rival to, this can look like a longer-term plan to erode some of the existing global economic architecture. And I think in some of the cases, the instincts on the response to that were not hugely helpful, and there was a better way to get to, and I think that's been collectively realised, and I think we saw with the Xi Jinping visit a kind of I mean, it's been described as almost a truce on the AIIB, that it is that China has one of the most difficult bits during the Xi Jinping visit in terms of reaching an agreement. One of the bits of the text and things that there was most struggle with was about this question about China's role in the economic system, and would China agree with the US and the economic policy officials that that we were all working to the same underlying standards, there was no rival to the existing system, that the existing system would be supported. There was a lot of tension on the Chinese side about that, and it reflects the fact that I think in China as well there are quite different views on what this amounts to. But it was agreed, and I think Xi Jinping personally kind of finally signed off on some of the most sensitive areas in the text on that. But I think it's the most interesting and difficult bit for both sides to navigate, because it cuts across issues, economic, strategic, political, developmental, in a way that I think the last phase of what China was doing just didn't pose the problem in such a complex way. I mean, in South Asia, I mean, there's clearly going to be a question of how much money, if China grows at, say, let's say Chinese growth dropped off to 5%, to take what would be quite a bleak scenario, I would suggest. How will there be the same level of resources channeled into military spending? Of course, the size of the Chinese economy still now means that, 4 years at that growth level, and you still add the entire size of the Indian economy, for instance, if you're looking at it in a South Asian context. So I think now versus, say, 10 years ago, when some of these things looked in closer symmetry, China's capacity to add military capabilities without having to spend double-digit levels on its military is easier in a sense. And of course, you just saw with in the last round, even kind of, how do you trim the troop numbers and things that Xi Jinping just announced the big reduction in troop numbers. For Pakistan, equally, the gap has opened up as well with India, and that's why the nuclear piece has become so important, because the nuclear realm is really the realm between the two sides, where there is still some meaningful concept of strategic balance, and it's one of the reasons that China has been so keen to support the nuclear piece of Pakistan's capabilities, because it still values strategic balance in the region, and the conventional side, it's harder to reach that given the size of the two countries and growth that there's been in the last period of time. And so in one sense, you can see gaps appearing. India, though, is now one of the only countries of the BRICS that is now growing at significant levels. So there's kind of whether you look at this in over the coming decades or something, rather than just in the next 10 years, you could come to slightly different answers.